So, a century after his birth, how much of modern politics can be traced back to Castro's revolutionary vision? What does his legacy mean for Africa today? To unpack this, we're joined by Mbasa Mvenene, a political science lecturer at the university, at Walter Sisulu University. We want to unpack Fidel Castro's complicated and obviously enduring influence in the African politics. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good say. Just a correction there. It's now called E-University Walter Sisulu.
Oh, E-University Walter Sisulu.
Yes.
No, I'm happy with that. I think it makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you so much for that correction. So I want us to begin with understanding who was Fidel Castro and what was the Cuban revolution fundamentally all about.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good starting point for the conversation. Well, Fidel Castro is or was a lawyer by training, but one who was radicalized, if I may say, in university as a result of the government of that time. And so Castro then, after a struggle after graduation, found that he needs to find a way of striking a blow, a way of creating a massive change within Cuba. And he found that party politics or pursuing power through elections was not helping because, of course, at that time, that government was not fond of fair political competition. And so Castro then, with his brother and other like-minded men, thought that they should actually organize themselves into a guerrilla army, right, where they then trained there in the mountains and, of course, in preparation to go back into Cuba and to take control of Cuba through the use of arms. And, of course, they were joined by, I think, the now immortalized Ernesto Che Guevara, to actually go back, take control of Cuba in 1959. And in essence, shortly after that, they then made it abundantly clear to the world that they were a socialist country and that their foreign policy was one that would support the underdogs in the world. And so I believe in essence that is who Fidel Castro is. He is a person who I believe, for me, personifies the sacrifice of self for the service of humanity. And so I think that, if I may steal the words from Guevara himself, that people who do such acts actually people who are driven by great feelings of love, because to think about changing society is something that means one has a lot of love for his own country or for his or her own people. So Castro for me is really that kind of a person, and that was the Cuban Revolution in 1959.
And from what I'm understanding is that the revolution came as a result of someone who was mostly, backed by the U.S., who was a dictator. I'm struggling to pronounce their name, but Fulgencio Batista, yes. That person was from Cuba, but he was just a dictator that was mostly carrying a lot of Western ideas, and that did not work for the people of Cuba.
I think it wasn't just Western ideas, but I think in a very crude way of saying this, I could simply say that the fellow was in charge of a puppet government. So the government, in essence, was externally controlled by U.S. interests, in that the Cuban economy became the playground of U.S. multinational corporations. So in essence, what you found with Batista's regime was that it was a regime that was really a surrogate administration, if one may say, that was really in power to quell resistance inside Cuba and to ensure that whatever foreign interests want to extract or exploit from Cuba, they are freely able to do that without little or no gain to Cuba's development, Cuba's sovereignty, social and economic areas. So Batista was that kind of a leader, and he used an immense force against his own people within Cuba. Hence, elections really were not an option for a person like Fidel Castro and, of course, like-minded people.
And now let's talk about what is it that about the Cuban Revolution, particularly its ideas about sovereignty, imperialism, capitalism, and socialism, that made it resonate with liberation movements beyond Cuba, including obviously Africa, where they said no to imperialism, no to capitalism. What is it that made them resonate with, for example, a movement like the ANC or any other, liberation movement in the African continent?
Okay, sure. Well, I think the what makes it resonate, I think in essence, is very simple. If you are a group of people that are experiencing oppression, exploitation, and exclusion, and you've seen that the people of Cuba have been able to emancipate themselves out of oppression, exploitation, and exclusion, you will then see that as a model. You will then find strength and inspiration from the Cuban Revolution. And of course, Cuba's foreign policy was one that was actively showing diplomatic and material support to liberation movements within Africa. We saw the example with Guinea-Bissau, where we saw the close relationship between Cuba and Amilcar Cabral there. We saw the relationships between Cuba and DR Congo, the relations with Cuba and Angola, the MPLA government in Mozambique with Samora Machel's government, and clearly, so in Congo, this guy's name came to mind, Laurent Kabila was one fellow who was supported by the Cuban government. So they provided a model and inspiration for oppressed people in the continent.
For Kabila, Laurent Kabila, it might have been difficult, not to say the South African one was also easy. Maybe most of the African ones were not as easy as one would have wanted them to be. But if you're talking about, I don't want to move away from Fidel. I just want to reflect on taking over from Mobutu, who has been in for 32 years, and you look at the magnitude of the damage that would have happened in the Congo at the time. There was a lot of influence that Kabila had to, have in the people of the Congo. Could we say maybe his death, just shortly after taking over office, might have resulted in probably the teachings from Fidel or the ideas that Cuba would have inspired him to just disappear? Could have then been the idea? Because if we look at Congo today, doesn't look really good.
Okay, sure. So I think your question is asking about Laurent Kabila and his death and its relation to Cuba's ideas.
Yeah, I'm saying because he was influenced by Fidel, but now after taking over office, he sadly passed, and then the problems in Congo starts again, where people thought, we've got someone who is progressive that might assist us to, overcome the 32-year rule of Mobutu that was very brutal to the people. His death, I'm just want to say, did it kill the spirit of the people, especially from the inspiration that he would have drawn maybe from Fidel?
Okay. Yes, definitely. I think also at the same time, I think there's what we call fatigue. When people have been in a state of resistance for quite a extended period, people tend to get to a point of tiredness. People cannot fight and resist over extremely long periods, especially in cases like the DR Congo, where the government is not shy of using its own military against the people. So I think that as much as the people of Congo would have, connected with those ideas from Kabila, but I believe that at some point fatigue does develop, and people tend to just turn off and begin to acquiesce to any kind of leadership that is in place.
Cuba went beyond simply expressing political solidarity with the African continent or the movements, the liberation movements within the continent. It provided military, political, medical, and educational support in different parts of Africa. What does that tell us about the kind of international role that Castro believed in as a revolutionary? And what role that did he play in that whole aspect?
Well, I think, like I said, I think Fidel Castro is really an embodiment of humanity, and I think the ideas from socialism, the idea of internationalism, right, is what Castro really practicalized for everybody, because remember, there were a lot of countries that showed support for African countries or global South countries, but this was only statements of support, and Castro went beyond that. Or Cuba went far beyond that, like you said, in terms of the provision of material support to ensure that liberation happens within these countries. And I think that to a great extent, Cuba has really been punished for having that kind of internationalist position within the world. And in essence, I think that if we didn't see the fall of the Soviet Union or the disintegration of the Eastern European socialist countries, I think the world today, or at least the global South today, would really be in a better socio-economic position than it is today, because with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries came a unipolar world where small states like Cuba, although it had outsized influence, small states like Cuba were easily pressured and isolated and forced into acquiescence by very, very powerful states.
Would someone ask and say, did communism work for the country or for a country like Cuba?
Well, I think our assessment of communism must always be awake to the reality that whenever a state declares to be communist in its economics, what happens within 24 hours is that that country will be faced with immense sanctions. So you cannot assess the success of socialism in a circumstance where Cuba has been under sanctions and a very extreme blockade, I believe, since the late 60s up to this point. So we cannot really assess communism, for instance, in a state like Cuba. But if we assess communism in, for instance, the Soviet Union, then you'll find that we can fairly assess communism there. But with a small state, a small island that has been sanctioned, isolated, and blockaded, then you cannot conduct a fair assessment of communism there.
Someone is sitting and have heard about the terminology or the term or the word communism. What does it mean? What is it? What is that? What kind of political idea is this? And I'm asking this because I want us to still go deep into what Fidel believed in.
Okay. So to make this simple for the listener, right? So let's contradistinguish capitalism and communism. So if capitalism is primarily about private property ownership, then communism is about the opposite. It's about abolishing private property, and it is all for the public ownership of property. So property here includes assets, it includes minerals, it includes all resources within the country. And if under capitalism, then the individual is sovereign, then under communism, the community outweighs the individual. And so under communism, you also see that the state becomes the custodian of all property and wealth of that particular state. If we can look at a modern example, we can, for instance, look at Bolivia, right? Just before we had this current regime, right? I think under Evo Morales, we can look at Bolivia at that point in time. We can see that in Bolivia, there's a huge understanding that the resources of that country must work for the public benefit of that country. The resource wealth of that country cannot work for the benefit of companies, corporations, or individuals. And so it's the opposite under capitalism. The resources and minerals of countries are owned and benefit individuals, companies, and corporations, and not the public and not the nation. So I think in essence, communism is about public ownership. It's about resources and wealth benefiting the nation and not individuals. I think that's in essence how we can understand communism.
Fidel Castro, as we mentioned when we started our conversation, is that he influenced quite a lot of political figures, political movements within the African continent, but scholars as well. His influence and his ideas or ideologies, if we look into the African continent now, are we seeing the same tune in terms of where we want to see ourselves, or we have our own understanding on how total emancipation of Africa should look like?
Can you please come again with the question?
So I was just saying, if you're looking into, obviously Fidel Castro had a big influence in the African continent, to some,
definitely have our different interpretations. I think both within the scholarship and within, for instance, policy literature, or within the popular discourse or conversations like the one we are having now, I believe that there are almost infinite differences about how we see, even the idea of total emancipation. When I think of that idea, I think of Mkhonto weSizwe Party, this idea of total emancipation, So there are definitely differences there. Some ideas are more on focused on Pan-Africanism as the ultimate solution to a total emancipation. Some ideas place emphasis on immediate socialism, while some ideas may place emphasis on a more moderate approach where you see, for instance, language such as Africa's integration or regional integration before we get to a continental integration. And then domestically, right, you'll find that there are different understandings or interpretations of what is best for the nation. There are also a lot of differences about what is good for our 54 countries on the continent. So I think unlike what we saw in the 1960s, 1970s, where we saw almost an agreement in the scholarship, today what we see are a lot of differences and disagreements and even unnecessary fights that are really delaying a process that Africa needs with urgency.
My guest this evening on Africa at a Glance is Mbasa Mvenene, was a political studies lecturer at University Walter Sisulu. I hope I said it right this time around.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, the 54 countries in the African continent. I think I was having a conversation with a guest yesterday from North Africa. We were looking into, obviously, technology and the development of the African continent. And there were so many things that we spoke about when it comes to, the opportunities that the continent presents, but that still needs to be explored. I want us to talk a little bit about, then directly, South Africa and its relationship with Cuba. Maybe if you can go through on how it came about.
Okay, so let me just start with a quick history there. So I think the relations start off with Cuba's immense involvement in Angola and with its support for the MPLA against the UNITA rebel group that was trying to unseat the MPLA government in Angola. And of course, the rebel group there was supported by the apartheid government's national defense at that particular time. And of course, that didn't end in the favor of apartheid South Africa or UNITA forces. So then following that, we then saw the independence of Angola, not necessarily independence, but we saw the consolidation of that particular regime. And we then saw that contributing to the independence of Namibia as well. So what that really did was that it shifted the balance of forces within Southern Africa. And of course, that then further intensified pressure on the apartheid regime. And this is because the apartheid government was confident that militarily it was a regional power and it could exert control on the region through destabilization, through intervention and proxy wars. And so that support by Cuba in 1988, where it saw the UNITA forces tactically retreating, was an indication that the apartheid regime could no longer dictate to the region, because now there was guaranteed resistance as a result of the support by Cuba. And now bringing it to more recent times, so these relations continued even after 1994, and I think South Africa's relations with Cuba have mainly been in the areas of education, and I think the most visible one being the medical training program, where Cuba agreed to train South African doctors. And by 2023, there was a record of 3,000 medical doctors that were successfully trained within Cuba. And of course, these doctors come from some of the most disadvantaged areas within South Africa. And that's another indication of the like I said, I've been saying throughout the interview, the embodiment by Castro and his country of humanity, because how best can you help other countries if not by helping them produce doctors that come from their most disadvantaged areas?
There's that long history that you've touched on, and probably you might have touched on this a little bit, but the significance that Cuba's involvement in the African continent in changing the politically trajectory of countries where it intervened, particularly in places such as Angola. There's that big, role that Cuba played in Angola. Maybe let's touch on it as well.
Okay, so just like I was explaining just now with that brief history there, so Cuba came into Angola and I believe in other former Portuguese colonies to come and offer support, and like you said earlier, to offer and not just abstract support, but material support, keeping in mind that Cuba offered support in the form of its own soldiers going into Angola, where many lost their lives. And Cuba sent this support there in the form of soldiers, arms, technicians, to ensure that the government of Angola at that time, as led by Agostinho Neto, did not fall, and in its falling, there would be the instatement of a government that was supported by a regime such as the apartheid regime. And I think our listeners all know that the apartheid regime was a bad idea, it was a bad government. And so obviously Castro would not support a bad government or support UNITA forces as they were, of course, backed by the apartheid regime. And so Castro went there, or not him going there, but lended support to Angola to ensure that the MPLA remains in control of Angola, as it was seen by Castro as a more like-minded government. So Castro did the same in Mozambique, he did the same in Guinea-Bissau, and he did that successfully. And I believe that this was also in advancement of the strategic interests of Cuba, because at that particular point, Cuba could sense that there would be further isolation of the country, and I believe they thought that if they are able to acquire more legitimacy and more alliances and more support in the global south, specifically in Africa, then they believed that they still stood a chance by rebuilding a socialist or left or bloc of the left globally.
There's quite a lot of things that you're touching on here, and I'm thinking on the times where these things are happening, because as we speak now, it might sound like just like just go there and do this, but it had a lot to do with networking, intelligence, but also getting into some African countries at the time were under apartheid, and also colonization was not as easy as one would want it, especially if you're coming up with like a different a different idea that you probably want to influence the people. Was it easy for Fidel, maybe, and the people that he worked with to meet with because maybe I assume it would be easier if maybe, say, the people or the leaders in Africa are able to get to Cuba, but maybe someone who's sent to Africa, would have that be easy for them, or there were those challenges, of course?
I believe that the communication, for instance, in Angola's case, would be a case where Angola would reach out to Cuba. But in some of these cases, we are informed that Cuba actually reached out to these countries first. But I believe that this communication or this relationship building would have been welcomed by countries like Angola and Mozambique, because we should keep in mind that this was for instance in Angola, a government that could see that its rule was challenged by a rebel force that carried significantly different ideas to its own ideas. So if the Angolan government at that time in 1987 could clearly see that the ideas of, for instance, nationalization, the ideas of sovereignty, the ideas that our resources and mineral wealth must benefit the nation or the public, if these ideas are all at risk or at jeopardy as a result of a rebel force that embodies capitalist ideas, then definitely Agostinho Neto would not have any quarrels with reaching out to Castro, in the same way Castro would not have quarrels with supporting a government that he sees to share the same or similar ideas on economics, on how to govern the country, and who should benefit from a country's resources or a country's minerals. So I think the communication there may have been difficult, but I believe that there was a commonality, there were commonly shared interests, and that I'm sure must have lubricated that entire process.
Yeah, no. Let's go back now to the ANC here in South Africa. There was obviously that very strong relationship between the ANC before it got into government with Cuba. It was still there even till this day. I think we did touch on it a little bit. But would you say within the shifting of political ideologies in the what's this, the liberation movement, which is the ANC, would that maybe caused a little bit of deflection from the principles that they would have, developed through their association with Cuba?
Well, I think let's maybe just make this disclaimer that when we think of liberation movements in South Africa, we shouldn't just think of the ANC or Mkhonto weSizwe. Let's also acknowledge APLA and Azandla and so on. But back to the ANC, and I think let's think of the ANC and the South African Communist Party, because I think the stronger relationship would be between the Cuban Communist Party and the South African Communist Party. And I think if we've been following what's been happening inside the tripartite alliance, we've seen that ever since the ANC's forming of the Government of National Unity with the Democratic Alliance and parties like the Freedom Front Plus, I believe that Solima Paela referred to that as a grave mistake. And I believe that these were his exact words, And so I believe that this was seen by the South African Communist Party as a volte-face or a complete reversal of the ANC's, I would say, ideological identity in terms of it becoming friends or getting into bed with a spin-off of the National Party in the form of the Democratic Alliance and the Freedom Front Plus. And so that change there was very highlighted after or during 2024. But I think the ANC was never really socialist or communist. I think the communist element or the socialist element was in the SACP. I believe the ANC, especially in the 1990s, the ANC was open to ideas of, privatization, the ideas of, the selling off of state assets, the ideas of private property ownership, the ideas of, an independent reserve bank, and so on and so forth. The ANC has never really been opposed to these ideas. These were ideas that were really opposed by, your South African Communist Party and earlier the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which I believe today may be more closer to the ANC than it is to the South African Communist Party.
Yeah, I think there was that division, or different views when the arrangement was made on how the government will be, the setting up of government, basically after the 2024 general elections. Let's take a back step a little bit now on Cuba itself. How did Marxism, socialism, and anti-imperialism shape the thinking of African liberation movements during the Cold War? I think we've mentioned some of them here, but in general in Africa, how did it shape the thinking during the Cold War?
So I think the ideas by Marx, ideas of socialism and so on, those ideas, I believe, were influential to a different degree, because there were leaders like your Samora Machel, there were leaders like your Agostinho Neto in Angola, there were your leaders in Guinea-Bissau who outrightly claimed to be Marxists, right? I believe there are interviews by Cabral where he talks about a class struggle in Africa and a class struggle in the international system. And then you also found that there were leaders like your Sekou Touré, your leaders like your Julius Kambaraj Nyerere, who claimed that we do not need Marx to understand that we are being exploited, right? Or we do not need Marx to understand that as African communities, we need to cooperate and publicly own our own resources. That is, in fact, what we were practicing before the invasion by colonial forces. So Marxism, Leninism, those were ideas that were influential, but not influential across the board or in all liberation movements. There were select movements that were outrightly Marxist, and then there were other movements that said that they do not want to uncritically import Marxism because, it's a European a concept, and Marx, of course, was writing as a European himself, writing about the industrial revolution within Europe, something that did not happen within the African context. And so it was influential, but I believe it was most important to explain our own exploitation to each other. And I think Marxism was also useful for inspiring people to see armed resistance as a viable method to acquiring independence from colonial yoke.
I tried to read about Karl Marx. It's quite a lot that has been said there. His teachings are still, sparking a lot of debate across the academic side, but not just the academic side, but also in politics, where sometimes then it will boil down to the ordinary people of South Africa, or maybe ordinary people, in fact, in the continent, on his teachings, because there are so many things that he is challenging on his his work, in fact, what he has done when it comes to the challenging of imperialism. Particularly that part is some people find it very problematic when you talk about that. But we've touched on Marxism now, but does South Africa's liberation movement emerge from the tradition that included armed struggle? We spoke about Marxism now, revolutionary politics, but ultimately it produced a constitutional democracy based on multi-party elections, individual rights, and political popularism. How do we understand about the transition ideologically?
Okay. That's a very, very interesting question. They're very interesting. Well, I think it goes back to what I said about the distinction that's very important between the South African Communist Party and the African National Congress. So we must all understand that the African National Congress is a broad church, meaning that in the African National Congress, you can find a communist, you can find a socialist, you can find a nationalist, you can find a capitalist, you can find a traditionalist, all within or inside the ANC. And so these ideas, the Marx, the Lenin, the Luxemburg, the Gramsci, all of these ideas were really something that was daily conversation in the South African Communist Party. Remember, But at some point in the 40s and 50s, there was an idea that, the members of the Communist Party were actually more cultured or more well-read than those who were in the ANC. And so my point is that the Marxist ideas, the ideas of communism, stayed within the ANC, stayed within the SACP in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. And what was happening in the late 1980s and early 1990s? In that period, it was when the apartheid government, ANC leaders, and the big business in South Africa were meeting regularly to carve out what would become what you just explained as a constitutional democracy that is based on individual rights and so on and so forth, multi-party elections and so on. And so I believe that, in fact, former President Thabo Mbeki used to be an NEC member of the Communist Party, but, surprisingly, at around 1990 or 91, he just stopped attending meetings of the SACP because he could see that the action towards forming a government is happening inside the ANC, and the SACP was still was somewhat being left out, or was somewhat being too slow to move to catch the train that involved ANC leadership, big business, and the apartheid government that was really negotiating, like we say, the negotiated settlement that we would see in the 1993 interim constitution and in the 94 election and the 1996 constitution. So I think the Marx thing kind of was left in the SACP, and we saw that from 1996 going forward, we saw the gear policy, which clearly showed everyone that the communist, socialist, Marxist trajectory in the ANC was really something of the past.
And with that, maybe what I would want to understand is that if we look at the South African, we did touch on the multi-party system, but could we say that the influence of Fidel is as a result of having political parties like the EFF in South Africa, which are new political parties if you compare to if you leave out PAC, AZAP, or SACP, when we're talking about literally 15 years ago, there was then the EFF coming up. Could this be one of the results of the influence of Fidel?
Yes, definitely. I think there are a lot of young people are activated into politics by, political figures like your Fidel Castro, because if we look at Castro, look at Guevara, and other leaders like themselves, their ideas and their actions would mostly appeal to a younger person than a person who simply wants security, stability, and predictability. So young people do not want those things because they live in a sustained state of insecurity, especially today. So I believe that the EFF was definitely inspired by the ideas of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. If we may recall, if we look at the EFF's 2013 conference, I believe it was on July 26th. And if we understand Castro's own party, it is actually called the July 26th movement. And I believe that even the former deputy president of the EFF, Floyd Shivambu, has made clear references to traditions in the EFF and those in the Cuban Revolution or the Cuban Communist Party.
And maybe in closing, that one idea that you say the people of Africa should understand about the politics of liberation movement, and as well as obviously the influence of the leaders like Fidel Castro had in Africa.
Well, I would simply say that I think African leaders and Africans in general must wake up to the idea that Africa must unite or perish. And of course, these are the words of Kwame Nkrumah. So I believe that we can try all sorts of other things, but if we do not unite, then we will perish, definitely.
Yeah, no, Mbasa Mvenene, thank you so much, my brother, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Mbasa Mvenene, political studies lecturer at University Walter Sisulu.